you have enough money coming in to pay your obligations. That's what, I don't know if people remember that, but that's what it actually was. And so he was in favor of balancing the budget. He was actually in favor of actually reducing taxes. And so that's why the conservatives really like him.
Franklin Roosevelt, your colleague Jonathan Darman makes the case that he learned empathy from polio. Right. What else did you learn from Darman?
Jonathan Darman has a theory that FDR was a nice person, but he was intellectually not all that gifted. Nobody around him ever thought he was going to be president of the United States except his mother. Nobody ever thought he was all that much of a leader. He was more an effete, kind of aristocratic person who had led a very, very pampered life. And then he contracted polio. And when he first got it, he probably got it by going to a Boy Scout jamboree, and at that point is probably where he got it. He didn't realize he had it for a while. He couldn't move his legs when he was with his family at Campobello. They didn't know what it was. It took 30 days before they had a doctor really diagnose it. Had they known what it was on the first day, they probably could have treated it more effectively, and he probably would have been able to walk again. But because they waited so long and they didn't give him proper treatment, he never could walk again. He looked like he could walk, but he was always holding on to somebody else. But the theory behind this article and this interview is that Roosevelt was relatively a pampered, effete aristocrat, but because the polio gave him such drive to learn how to walk again, to appear to be vigorous, that he gave him a grit and a personality and a drive that he never actually had before. And so the theory is that without polio, Roosevelt never would have been elected president, and he never would have been able to do all the things he did as president, and he served 12 years as president. Sadly, he ran for a fourth term, and he was probably half dead at the time. He'd only lived 45 days into the second term, and then Truman became president, and Truman had only met Roosevelt twice in his life, once before he was president and once while he was vice president. They only met twice. He had no knowledge of the atomic bomb secret. He didn't know anything about the war strategy, because in those days, there was no office for a vice president in the executive office building or the White House. The only office was up on Capitol Hill, so they never even saw each other. And then it's amazing that he became president of the United States with so little knowledge.
Truman, as you said, the McCullough book is definitive, but Jeffrey Frank focused on his presidency and praised him both for the civil rights accomplishments and also for the fact that FDR had wanted to pick Jimmy Burns, who was a big segregationist. Things could have turned out so differently if someone else had been picked.
Well, Burns had been Secretary of State, but he was a racist, and it was generally thought that it might be too complicated to pick that person, so ultimately he picked Truman. Roosevelt's first vice president was John Nance Garner, who famously said, the vice presidency is not worth a pitcher of warm spit. And that's not actually what he said. He actually said, it's not worth a pitcher of warm piss, but it was cleaned up over the years. And so after 8 years, he was done. He didn't want the job anymore. Then they got Henry Wallace, who was very liberal and maybe thought to be too liberal, and Roosevelt was nervous about him, so he got rid of Wallace, and he was looking for somebody else. And people recommended Truman, who was done a reasonably good job as a senator, seen as part of a corrupt machine in Missouri, but he was seen as pretty honest himself. But, you know, amazingly, he was not a person who had any college degree. Every other president in the 20th century had a college degree, but not Truman. And then he turned out to be, I think, one of our best presidents.
Eisenhower and Susan Eisenhower on her father-in-law? No, her father.
That's her grandfather.
Her grandfather.
Dwight Eisenhower had two children, two sons. One died very young, and then the other one, John, lived on, and he had three children, two daughters, and a son, David Eisenhower, and then two daughters, Susan and Ann. And I was growing up as a little boy. I remember Eisenhower. Some of you nobody here looks as old as me, but Eisenhower was, I thought he was an old man. But I looked it up. How old was he when he was elected president of the United States? 62. We'd love to have a president that young, right? But he was only 62 years old. And he was famous for playing a lot of golf. We wouldn't ever elect a president who plays golf, all right? But Eisenhower, while people in my era thought he did very little as president, in fact, he got the interstate highway system through without using appropriated dollars. He got the space program off the ground. We built up an incredible strategic missile advantage over the Russians, and we didn't go to war. No soldier was killed during Eisenhower's term as president. So we had a lot of prosperity. The United States zoomed past the rest of the world in the economy. We were, right after World War II, we were 50% of the world's GDP. And so a lot of that prosperity came about under Eisenhower, but he was relatively not a guy that wanted to brag about it. In fact, he was one of the people who took greater pride in what he did before he became president than what he did as president. And Susan Eisenhower recounts his history as president, and then it turns out he was the best person who was president who knew how to cook. He actually learned how to cook. He was from a family in Texas and Kansas, and his family was all German speaking. I mean, they were descendants from Germans, and they spoke German in his household. Think about this. He's a pacifist. His family were pacifists, and his father was a pacifist, and they spoke German in the household because they were descendants from German immigrants just one generation removed. Yet he was ultimately the person who became the general who had to go to war and kill so many people as the leader of the military effort in Europe and to go against his Germans. So it's really unusual situation. He was also a star football player. And it was famous that he famously tackled Jim Thorpe in a way that injured Jim Thorpe. It was an effort to kind of stop this great football player. But that tackle was so tough that Eisenhower never really regained his ability to play football very effectively.
And that incredibly moving scene that Susan Eisenhower relates when right before D-Day he goes around and asks the soldiers who are about, knowing that 70% of them might die, did you go fly fishing in Michigan? So
and remember, Eisenhower wrote out a statement saying, assuming that it didn't work, I bear sole responsibility for the failure. And he had that, and he carried around his wallet, and if it didn't work, he was going to issue that statement because he wanted to bear the responsibility. If it didn't work, he took this whole blame. Interestingly, there are those of you who have prospered late in your career, think about this. At 52 years old, Eisenhower is a colonel with no great responsibility. He had been an aide to Douglas MacArthur, but he didn't really have a high regard for MacArthur. He thought MacArthur was too much of an egotist. But at 52 years old, he was thinking of leaving the military because he was a colonel and didn't look like he was ever going to be a general, let alone a five-star general. And so between the ages of 52 and 60, he became a superstar. And how did that happen? Well, because in the end, he was able to get along with people reasonably well. He was a good writer. And so when Roosevelt wanted somebody that could get along with Churchill, which wasn't easy, who could lead the military effort in Europe, it was supposed to be George Marshall, but Roosevelt said, I need George Marshall to stay in Washington. So Marshall and Roosevelt picked Eisenhower, who had no combat experience. He had never had any combat experience. He'd never been in combat. So they gave him some combat experience by letting him lead the effort in Africa and then in Italy, and later with some combat experience, he then led the effort into Normandy.
Amazing. All right, I'm reluctant to skip Kennedy, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and George H.W., but we got 7 minutes left, and you have 3 interviews with living presidents that I want to ask you about. The first is with President Bill Clinton and Hillary Rodham Clinton. What did you learn from that?
I've known them for quite a while. I didn't work for them, but I've known them for a while, and I had an opportunity to interview both of them together. And when you think about it, we've had a lot of powerful first ladies, but nothing was comparable to Hillary Clinton because she was, when they were running for election the first time, they said 2 for the price of 1. And what people didn't really know what they meant, but she was really an intellectual partner of Bill Clinton. She was a better law school student, as Bill Clinton would say, than he was. And while Bill Clinton is really, really smart and has a great policy knowledge and has a beautiful brain in many ways, Hillary Clinton is probably smarter. She's very, very smart, and she wanted to be more involved. And so even though Eleanor Roosevelt broke the mold for a first lady that was very actively involved in helping her husband in some ways, Hillary Clinton broke the mold again. And remember, while she was first lady, after she finished, as they were wrapping up the second term, she ran for the United States Senate. No first lady ever run for any office before. She got elected to the Senate and then got reelected and then ultimately became Secretary of State. So I interviewed them both together, and it's a complicated interview because, they don't like to do interviews together. I think they don't like to talk over each other and then get into disagreements, and so they don't really do that many interviews together. But this one I did in New York together, and I think it went pretty well.
It was great. You started off by asking about their grandkids, and it was often running from there. President George W. Bush, I hope I can share this. Right. He painted your picture after the interview. He painted your portrait.
Right. George W. Bush painted a picture of me. He's a painter now, and it sort of semi-looks like me. But
no, it's a lovely likeness. You look great.
George W. Bush I got to know extremely well because while I was working for Carter and his father was the vice president for Reagan and running against us, after Bush was defeated for re-election to Bill Clinton, he became an advisor to my firm, Carlyle, and I spent a couple of years, many years, maybe 10 years, traveling the world with him. And I thought he was the nicest man I ever met in my life. Just a gentle soul, really smart, really funny in many ways. And through him, I got to know W pretty well. And the reason that W has that name and not George Herbert Walker Bush Jr. is this. I asked Bush, why did you name your son Jr.? He said, because when I was growing up in Greenwich, I had two middle names, George Herbert Walker Bush. And people made fun of me. Little boys said, how come you have two middle names? They made fun of me. I said, I don't want to do that with my son. So I said, I'm never going to give him two middle names. W was a person who not taken seriously by his family at all. When he said he was going to run for governor, the first time his mother said, you'll never win. And in that first night of the election, when he was running against Ann Richards, his mother and father chartered a plane to go to Florida to be at the celebration of Jeb Bush, who was running for governor of Florida. And it turned out that Jeb Bush lost and George Bush won. And how did George Bush go from being governor of a state to being president? Let me tell you an inside story. I don't think it's quite in the book. I didn't want to put that in. But what actually happened was this. The governor of Texas doesn't have much authority. The legislature meets 120 days every other year. Every other year. It doesn't really do much. And the cabinet is appointed by the lieutenant governor, not the governor. So after Bush was elected and then reelected, all of a sudden the pollsters are saying, who would you like to see as next president of the United States? Well, overwhelmingly, people said in the Republican Party, we want to see George Bush. And why would that be? Because as governor, you didn't really get to do that much, and he wasn't that well known outside of Texas. Well, the answer was, if you went into the internals of the polling data, it said that people thought they were picking George Herbert Walker Bush to run another term. So if his name had been David Bush, it might not have risen so high in the polling data. But he turned out to be a president who had to deal with the most consequential attack on our country since Pearl Harbor, and that was 9/11. I think he rose to the occasion. I do think we could have handled Afghanistan differently. And the reason we didn't do better in Afghanistan, in my view, is that Donald Rumsfeld hated Colin Powell, hated him. And Colin Powell had invented the idea of massive force, which we used in Kuwait. And Donald Rumsfeld wanted to say, the Secretary of State then, Colin Powell, we don't need the Powell Doctrine. I can get Osama bin Laden with a few troops. They only sent 10,000 troops in Afghanistan. So we let Osama bin Laden escape through Tora Bora, and as a result, we didn't capture him, and then it took another 10 years to get him. Had we put more troops there, had we followed the Powell Doctrine and put 100,000 troops into Afghanistan, we would have captured Osama bin Laden almost certainly. And the result was that we then decided to have a diversionary attack on Iraq, which I think was a mistake. And I did ask President Bush, if you had known there was no weapons of mass destruction, would you have gone in? And he said, probably not. And I think he was pushed to do it by a lot of the neocons, and it was, I thought, somewhat diversionary because it was kind of taking into account we hadn't captured Osama bin Laden. We hadn't really avenged the loss we'd had on 9/11. But it was a tragic situation, I think, in many ways.
That probably not was a very significant revelation. Two more interviews. President Donald Trump, when did you interview him and what did you learn?
I've known him for a while. I interviewed him one time before he was president. I got him to come to the Economic Club of Washington, and in the green room he said, ask me if I'm going to run for president. I said, president of what? He said, president of the United States. I said, you're not going to be president of the United States. He said, I know, but it helped my brand a bit. He exaggerates sometimes. For example, he called me the day after that interview. I did the Economic Club. He said, David, it's the highest rated show ever carried on C-SPAN. He said he got the ratings, and C-SPAN, the ratings were the highest of any show ever on C-SPAN. So I called the head of C-SPAN and said, what were the ratings? He said, we don't have ratings. So, but I've gotten to know Trump, and actually, one-on-one, leave the policy things aside, one-on-one, he can be a very charming person. I had dinner with him to prepare for this, went down to Mar-a-Lago, and I've known Mar-a-Lago for a while because before he got involved in politics, my parents who lived in Baltimore, when they moved to a suburb of Baltimore called West Palm Beach, Florida, I used to go down there and have events there, and it was very pleasant. And then I had dinner with him there, and he agreed to do the interview, but the only time we could do it was the day of the trial. And I said, you're really going to be able to focus on this interview? He said, no problem. So I had the interview, and then a couple minutes later, we went into one of the trials. The interview with Joe Biden, I've known Biden for a long time, and it's public knowledge that I let him use my house in Nantucket for Thanksgiving. He likes to go to Nantucket for Thanksgiving. It's a 40-year family tradition, and I don't like to be in the cold weather in Thanksgiving, so he goes there. He likes my house. I would say I've known him a long time. I'll see him this weekend because we have a celebration of the Blair House. I think it's the 200th anniversary of the Blair House, and I've helped reconstruct it. And so I've known him for a long time. He's pretty much what you see is what you get. He's a blue-collar kind of guy, snappy on the back, really cares about relationships. I don't think at the time I did the interview, he expected to run. And I think when the history is written, the biggest mistake that either party made or either person made in this campaign was to agree to an early debate. If Donald Trump loses the election, it'll be because he agreed to an early debate. Had he not had an early debate and he